Hey guys, it's Glenn Mathewson with BuildingCodeCollege.com. Some of you may know that I collect vintage code books and that I like history. So obviously I like code history. Well, if you look behind me on this shelf right here, you'll see there's a book missing from that bookend. That's because I've got it in my hands right here. It's called Reading in Code Administration. This book is from the 1970s, but it includes stories from across the country from working, building, and fire officials all the way back to as far back as the 1930s. I enjoy reading these stories. It gives me perspective about the code industry and about the history that's brought us to where we are today. And I thought, if I'm spending the time reading these, why not read them with you guys and share them with you? So I'm testing out a new idea today on how I can go about doing that, and bit by bit working through all three of these volumes and sharing this history with you. So I appreciate your feedback on this. This is definitely a beta test idea here. Thanks a lot and hope you enjoy. Readings in Code Administration, Volume 1, History, Philosophy, Law. Part 1, Story 1, Early History and Development of Building Codes, by James P. Thompson, former structural engineer for the National Bureau of Standards. This story was reprinted from Boca News in June 1957 on pages 2 through 5. The italicized intro reads, "We can trace back the performance-type building codes of today to the Code of Hammurabi, written in 2000 BC. Hammurabi's code, like later building regulations of early London, New York, and Boston, reflect the concerns and rough technology of the times. Although today we do not require the same eye for an eye justice that Hammurabi did, our codes do share the same basic concern for structural and fire safety. It is instructive to trace the development of building codes from the earliest known records, beginning with those in the laws of Hammurabi, through the periods of Greek and Roman law, the 1189 Ordinances of London by Henry Fitz Elwine, the laws passed by Parliament in 1667 on the rebuilding of London after the Great Fire, and finally through the past 50 years. Perhaps the strides taken in the last 50 years surpass those of all the previous centuries. But the examples of codes handed down to us are especially interesting since they reflect the nature of society they served and the state of knowledge of that society. The primary purpose of building regulations is to provide a high degree of assurance that building and structures will be safe to occupy or to use for their intended purposes. However, the manner of stating code requirements has become complex, just as structures have become more and more complex, particularly when new building materials are continually being introduced. To provide a code capable of meeting the ever-changing conditions, to provide a means for permitting the use of new materials, I believe that should read, for permitting the use of new materials, and to resolve some of the inequities in codes from the standpoint of use, there is being developed today what is called a performance code. Such a code simply states the requirements for the functions that the various parts of a structure are expected to perform. By examining some of the ancient laws, it is seen that this type of code is not new, and that man has used it before in one form or another. To our knowledge, the first written regulations of code concerning the construction of buildings appeared some 2,000 years BC in Babylon, then ruled by Hammurabi. Several sections dealt with the obligations of contractors to owners and provided simply that if a house collapsed, the owner would pay the owner's loss in like fashion. For example, if the owner were killed, the contractor was to be put to death. Or if the owner's son were killed, the contractor's son would be put to death, etc. Depicted here is the ruthlessness of the society, yet the simplicity of its requirements. There was no attempt to prescribe the manner in which a house was to be built as to wall thickness, size of timbers, etc., for the knowledge of the theory of buildings had not advanced that far. Rather, these requirements merely stipulated that the house should stand up. Today, we would call this a performance code of sorts. Certainly, the contractor must have considered it one. When other countries built large cities where men lived in close proximity, local officials, acting in the interest of public health and safety, attempted to regulate building practices, just as the officials of Hammurabi's Babylon did. The archaeological fragments of Greek and Roman laws give the first evidence of buildings being required to be inspected during construction. For example, the records of a building constructed by Socrates in 341 BC tell of these specific requirements. He shall set the joints against each other, fitting, and before inserting the dowels, he shall show the architect all the stones to be fitted, and shall set them true and sound, and dowel them with iron dowels, 2 dowels to each stone in each course, and 1 to the stone in the corner. In the Roman Republic, there were urban servitudes, which recognized the right of property owners, such as the right to rest beams on the adjoining neighbor's walls, the right to receive water from his eaves, and the right to force him to install water drains to dispose of the water, the right to receive light from over his garden wall, and the right to limit the height and extent of his buildings. Without the sanitary and building regulations enforced in Rome, it would have been quite impossible for that city to have housed its population in so small an area. The very existence of the city depended on these regulations. This is borne out of the fact that several centuries later, when the enforcement of the buildings and sanitary regulations became lax, widespread disease and pestilence caused the leading citizens to move to the north and leave the city to the mercy of the barbarians. The concern over fire and its spread had an early influence on the subject matter of codes, and from time to time was the deciding factor which brought about great changes in the codes of the day. After Rome was destroyed by fire, which had its start in one of the numerous buildings constructed of combustible materials, there were serious efforts to require all construction to be of masonry. Through the ages that followed, cities and counties had their own standards for the construction of buildings and means for seeing that they were maintained. A unique example of building code evolution took place in London in 1189, when the mayor of London, Henry Fitzelwine, issued an ordinance known as the Assise of Buildings. That would be spelled Assize of Buildings. This, among other things, permitted citizens to appear before the court to demand protection from those encroaching on their rights. The ordinance was referred to as a Planning Act. It contained much on the construction of buildings. Among the authorities of London, there must have been a constant fear of fire, for periodically new ordinances appeared, attempting to control construction to reduce this hazard. In 1212, thatch on roofs of new buildings was forbidden, and tile roofing required. However, serious fires continued to occur, and later all existing thatch on roofs of buildings was ordered removed. An ordinance in the time of King Edward II required chimneys to be of stone, tile, or plaster timber chimneys, probably plastered with mud, were forbidden. London was undergoing great changes at this time, and health conditions were becoming more and more acute because large numbers of people were crowded into tenements and houses. Queen Elizabeth, fearing a plague or epidemic, issued proclamations forbidding any new tenements or houses within 3 miles of the city gates. Although the proclamations had merit, they actually brought about more crowding in the buildings within the gates, because there was little or no control over their use or the number of occupants in them. In 1664, the plague came, to be checked only by a fire that left the city a smoldering ruin. As the new city arose from this ruin, building regulations were enacted by Parliament for the rebuilding of London, reflecting the growth in the knowledge of building technology. The regulations included 4 sorts of buildings, classified by the street widths of their locations and type of residence. These provisions regulated the number of stories, the thickness of external and party walls, the size of timbers, and other construction details to reduce the risk of fire. In addition to the new building regulations, surveyors who had the authority to invoke jail sentences on violators were appointed to enforce the provisions and were the first such officials in England. Perhaps this was the birthplace of the first building inspector. Building regulations in the United States arose from similar reasons. The early settlements of New York and Boston suffered greatly from fires, and the regulations stemming from these fires seem to have been passed with the sole purpose of preventing the spread of fire. Dwellings were specified to be built only of brick or stone and to be covered with a slate or tile roof. These regulations appear to be the forerunner of requirements for fireproof and fire-resistive building construction. However, since these regulations were not enforced, the situation for the most part remained unchanged. As time passed, amendments to existing codes and new codes showed improvement and included more and more data on the properties of materials being used for construction. For example, an entirely new code for Boston, adopted in 1892, for the first time contained limits on permissible stresses for wood, steel, cast iron, and masonry. The development of building codes in this country is quite complex because of the large number of legislative bodies that have enacted building legislation. By 1900, the number of building codes had become very large, and the general tendency was for these codes to become more and more detailed in an attempt to embrace the ever-increasing number of different building materials. Conditions were changing. New ideas as well as new materials were being brought forward, and efforts were being made to keep building codes abreast of developments. Many of these codes were under continuous reviews, but it was not easy to keep them up to date. Soon, the codes came in for criticism because of their restrictiveness. Often requirements which were desirable for some districts were too stringent for others. In some cases, a code would not permit the use of some new construction method or the use of a new building material. The divergence of opinion on the various details became more and more pronounced, and, because of public demand for a greater degree of uniformity in codes and for lower construction costs, a Senate committee directed its attention to the subject. As a result of its findings, a committee was established in 1921 known as the Department of Commerce Building Code Committee. This committee was composed of 7 nationally prominent architects and engineers, and its task was to study the problem scientifically and to develop specific recommendations for improvements. It relied on the National Bureau of Standards to provide the necessary staff to conduct tests and investigations and to publish the final recommendations. Prior to this, building codes were specification-type codes. Later, perhaps as a result of the reports of the Department of Commerce Committee, it was realized that the time had come for a new concept of building regulation, a concept based on the result to be achieved in a building and not the manner of its achievement. In other words, new concept holds that the requirements should be expressed in terms of performance rather than in terms of materials or method of construction. To accomplish such a transition, it became necessary to develop a knowledge of the criteria upon which to base minimum limits of performance. The search for new information and data to fill the gaps in our knowledge continued and is continuing today through research in laboratories and in the field. Over the years, the Building Technology Division of the National Bureau of Standards has made numerous contributions in the field of building research and is currently engaged in many projects which will ultimately add to the knowledge necessary for the improvement of building technology. One example of such work is a study of the bond between reinforcing bars and concrete. Not only is the bond important from a standpoint of anchorage, but it also is important with respect to the width and spacing of cracks in the concrete. which, in turn, affect the resistance of the reinforcement to corrosion. Another factor considered was the extent to which the concrete between two successive cracks participates in resisting tensile stresses. Another NBS, National Bureau of Standards, project was a study of the properties of precast thin shell concrete wall and roof panels, about 5 feet wide, which can be easily assembled by bolting and welding them together. Such construction lends itself to assembly line production and to stockpiling of concrete building elements that can be quickly assembled in times of emergency. In the field of assisting in the development of standard test methods, the Bureau devised a rapid and reproducible test method for determining the drying shrinkage in concrete building blocks. Activities of this type, which provide information on strength, durability, fire resistance, and other properties of building materials and of assemblies, are going on continually in universities, industrial, and government laboratories. Not to be overlooked are the professional and technical societies and code-writing organizations, whose members study, coordinate, and adapt for the vast amount of data obtained in the laboratory and the field. It is this vast and growing storehouse of knowledge that has permitted intelligent forward steps in the field of building technology. It may seem strange, but 4,000 years ago, Hammurabi used building controls that appeared to have been designed to accomplish a certain performance in buildings. Although his methods of trying to bring this about were harsh, perhaps he had no other choice. Knowledge was so limited in his day. Today, we are again writing requirements based on the principle of performance desired of buildings, but our position is just the opposite of Hammurabi's, since we have, or are obtaining, the necessary knowledge to attain our objectives. The drastic methods he resorted to, and the catastrophes that occurred in some of the great cities of the past, should be a sufficient reminder to us to make certain that we put our present-day knowledge of building technology to its best use. I hope you guys enjoyed that. You may have noticed that it referenced the 1892 Boston Building Code, which it just so happens I have in my collection. So I'll show you a peek at the specifications that were introduced that were mentioned in that story. You can pause the video if you'd like to take a closer look at these 1892 material specifications. Otherwise, I welcome your feedback as to whether you enjoyed this story and if you'd like me to continue reading through all 3 of these volumes in the coming days, weeks, months, and years. This has been provided to you by buildingcodecollege.com, where we go beyond the words.